The stranger's hand closed around Delaney Kovac's wrist, hard enough that she heard something in it give a small, quiet sound. He wasn't fully conscious. His eyes were open and seeing nothing. His jaw locked, sweat running down his temple, though the house was barely 50 degrees, and he was trying to push himself up on one elbow with a left leg that had both bones broken below the knee. She didn't pull away. She laid her other hand flat on his chest and pressed down with exactly enough force, and not 1 ounce more. "Lie down," she said, low, close to his ear. "You do that one more time and you don't keep that leg." He went back into the pillow, let out a ragged breath, and his fingers loosened off her wrist, leaving 4 pale marks that reddened slowly in the lantern light. 4 men had carried him into this house in the middle of an ice storm, on a garage door they'd taken off its track to use as a stretcher, after 22 miles of black ice. On the way, they had driven straight past the only clinic in town without slowing down, because the doctor there never answered his phone after dark, and because everybody across 6 counties knew whose door to knock on instead. Delaney Kovac was 28 years old. She had never held a nursing license, and she never would, and she had been doing her mother's work for 6 years without one, while not a single soul in that valley ever said so out loud, because the alternative to her was nothing at all. She pulled a chair up to the bed, sat down, and stayed there until the sky went gray. She had no idea who she had just saved. Then engines came up Millrace Road, not an ambulance. 4 black SUVs stopped nose to tail in the snow, headlights left burning, 4 doors opening at once. A man in a long wool coat came up the porch steps, looked past her shoulder into the house, and went completely still for a few seconds. "That's Mr. Corsetti," he said, and Otis Barrow, who had lived in that valley 52 years and had never once run from anything, went white to the lips. If this story makes you want to know what happens next, leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, drop us a comment, and subscribe, because stories like this one only stay alive as long as somebody stays to hear them through. The man in the wool coat stepped across the threshold and introduced himself as August Renwick before removing his hat. He took it off in the way people did only inside a church or in a home where someone lay gravely ill, and Delaney knew at once that he had stood in many rooms like this one before. His shirt was neatly pressed, even though dawn hadn't yet broken. His shoes were wet with melting snow, and he paused on the doormat long enough to stamp them clean. That small detail made Delaney a little less afraid of him, though she wouldn't have admitted it to anyone. 3 more people stood behind him, and the second was a man in his 50s, with silver white hair at his temples and an old wool coat patched at the elbows. He didn't wait to be invited in. He walked around Renwick and crossed the narrow kitchen, and when he saw the face on the pillow, he stopped in the middle of the floor and stood there for several seconds, his arms hanging at his sides. Then he lowered himself onto one knee beside the low bed, slowly, like a man whose knees were no longer what they used to be, and rested one hand on the edge of the blanket without touching the person beneath it. He looked at him for a long time. Delaney stood 3 steps away with the tray of cotton and gauze still in her hands, and no one in the room spoke for long enough that she could hear the fire crackling in the stove and someone outside on the porch knocking the snow from his boots. "Warren Pike," he finally said without turning around. "You can call me Warren." He rose by bracing one hand against his knee, and when he turned toward her, Delaney saw that his eyes were red. He made no attempt to hide it, and she thought that was the first thing that night that made her trust anyone. He took her hand between both of his. His hands were large, dry, and warm, and he held hers that way as he spoke. "Miss, I've held this boy in my arms since before he could walk. I taught him how to fish at Sanders Lake. I taught him to drive a stick shift on the old railroad tracks behind the factory, and he burned out one of my clutches. So his father made him wash my car for an entire summer." He laughed, a brief sound, and then the laughter faded. "Now I'm going to tell you something, and I mean it with all my heart. From this moment on, if you need anything at all, you tell me. Medicine, someone to keep watch at night, firewood, gasoline, food, a generator if the power goes out again. Don't hesitate, and don't go asking anyone else. You tell me." Delaney stood there with her hand enclosed between his, and she didn't know how to answer, because, in all the 6 years she had been doing this work, no one had ever entered this house and said those words to her. People came in and asked things of her. People came in, thanked her, and went home. No one had ever asked what she needed. "I have enough," she said. "No one ever has enough, miss," Warren Pike said. He released her hand, then turned to look at the bed one more time before stepping back to make room. Renwick waited until the moment had passed. Then he moved closer, looked down at the leg resting by itself on 2 pillows stacked one atop the other, and asked her a single question. "Tell me the condition of that leg." Delaney set the tray on the table. Closed fractures of both the tibia and fibula in the lower third. There aren't any fragments I can feel, and the skin isn't broken, which means he'll keep that leg if nothing else happens. It took me 3 attempts to draw the bones back into alignment. The 3rd time worked, and afterward, I could still feel the pulse on the top of his foot. I left several toes exposed beyond the bandages, so I could watch their color. He hasn't lost much blood because no major vessels were torn. It isn't the bone I'm worried about. It's the next 2 days. When both lower leg bones break in a large man, compartment syndrome can set in. And if that happens, the danger is measured in hours, not days. I'll recognize it before he has time to complain of the pain. No one in the kitchen said a word. Renwick looked at her, and he kept looking longer than politeness allowed. Delaney counted 4 seconds before he spoke again. "Where do you work?" he asked. Delaney wiped her hands on a towel and hung it on its hook, then answered in the same, even voice, neither faster nor slower than before. "I work the night shift at the warehouse out on 40th Street, she said. "I scan barcodes." "Then take him," Delaney said. "Right now. I can save that leg through the night, but I can't save it through 6 weeks in this house. And if compartment syndrome sets in, what he'll need is an operating room, not a kitchen. You have cars now, so go. Uniontown is 38 minutes away when the roads are dry." Renwick didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, lifted the burlap curtain with 2 fingers, and looked outside at the 4 cars parked there with their headlights still on. In those beams of light, the snow was flying sideways instead of falling. "Route 40 is closed from the gas station on up," he said. "Route 119 is closed too. I checked twice on the way here. And no helicopter is taking off in this weather. And you know that better than I do." He let the curtain fall. "That's the first reason, and it'll be gone in a day. There are 2 more reasons, and they aren't going away." He turned back and sat in the wooden chair across from her, his back straight and both hands resting on his knees. "Miss, any emergency room in this state that receives a patient injured in a motor vehicle accident is required to report it. It isn't a question of whether they want to. Those are the rules, and they'll file the report within a few hours. That name goes into the system, and there are people in that system who've been watching his company for 19 months, and they still haven't found what they need. If you take him to Uniontown this morning, then by this afternoon they'll have the date, the time, the route, and one very good question about what he was doing on that road at midnight." Delaney leaned against the edge of the table and folded her arms. "That's his business. It isn't mine." "No," Renwick said. "Not yet, but there's still the 3rd reason." He lowered his voice, not by much, only enough that the 2 men standing outside on the porch couldn't hear. "There are 3 groups in Pittsburgh, miss, and for the past year and a half, all 3 of them have wanted to know where Mr. Roop Corsetti is vulnerable. What they've never had is a specific answer. Now the answer is 6 weeks flat on his back, unable to stand. If that information leaves this house, then I'll tell you plainly, he won't live to see the end of the 2nd week, and no one will need to enter a hospital to make that happen." A piece of firewood split apart inside the stove, and no one flinched. Delaney looked down at the low bed, at the toes left exposed beyond the bandages, and then she spoke, her voice no louder than his. "Then there's something you need to know before I agree to anything, and I want to say it now, while he's still unconscious, so no one can claim later that I waited until I had the advantage before telling you." She pulled out the remaining chair and sat down, placing both hands on the table. "I finished nursing school the same year my mother became ill. She'd been an emergency room nurse for 31 years at the hospital down in town, the one that closed that spring. I was supposed to take my licensing exam in the fall. I didn't. I stayed home, and I worked. And I worked under her name for the final 2 years of her life, because she still had a license, and I still had 2 hands. I did the work, and she signed. Every form carried her signature, and every task was performed by my hands." Renwick said nothing. Warren Pike stood in the corner of the kitchen, and he said nothing either, but he had taken his hat from one hand and was holding it in both hands in front of his stomach. "She died in November," Delaney said. "By spring, I applied to take the exam. The board reviewed the records, found those signatures, and said that anyone who had practiced under another person's license lacked the moral character required to receive a license of her own. They barred me from applying again for 4 years. I still have 2 years left on that ban, and they won't license me, and I came to understand that a long time ago." She stood, walked to the bookcase beside the stove, pulled out the hardbound notebook at the end of the shelf, and opened it on the table in front of him. Tucked between the final 2 pages was a printed form, folded in half, with a signature on the bottom line, the handwriting crooked and broken, like that of someone writing in the dark. "An ambulance did come," she said. Nearly 3 hours late, after I'd already set the leg. 2 men came inside, looked at it, and one of them gave a low whistle. They said he had to be taken in. Then he heard the word hospital, and he was conscious enough to shake his head, and he signed this. I asked him again 3 times in front of both men. He still shook his head all 3 times. She closed the notebook. So don't tell me now that you're choosing to keep him here. He already made that choice himself when he barely knew where he was, and that's what has kept me sitting awake ever since. Within half a day, the whole town knew, because there was no way to hide 4 black cars parked on Millrace Road in a place with 3,400 people. But no one knocked on the door. No one passing by stopped in to ask after anyone, and the driveway in front of her house remained free of footprints for 2 full days. It took Delaney 4 days to understand that Otis Barrow had visited 11 houses that first morning, and had somehow let people know that Miss Kovacs was caring for a difficult case and couldn't receive visitors. She never thanked him for it, and he wouldn't have known what to do if she had. So when someone knocked late in the afternoon on the 4th day, she knew before she even opened the door that it wasn't anyone from the valley. The man standing on the porch was about 40, wearing a shiny nylon jacket and city shoes that weren't made for snow. He didn't wait to be invited inside. He walked straight into the kitchen and stood in the middle of the floor as though it belonged to him. He named a debt collection agency in Uniontown. Then he said the figure 9,000, then repeated it a second time, louder. He said the hospital had sold the debt long ago and that it belonged to his office now, and that he had sent 4 letters without receiving a reply. Delaney stood beside the sink with a pot in her hands and let him finish. She had heard those words before while standing in that exact spot, and she knew precisely how much money remained in her account. She knew it wasn't enough, and she intended to give him the same answer she had given the previous 4 times. But then a voice rose from the low bed beside the stove. It was quieter than the water boiling in the kettle behind her, and the entire kitchen fell silent. "Your father is Raymond Ulmer," the voice said. "He's still living in Grindstone." The man turned his head. The man on the bed didn't lift his head from the pillow, open his eyes any wider, or shift his position at all. He continued in the same even voice, like someone reciting something he had read long ago. "Your house on Hazel Road is held by Keystone Valley Bank, Brownsville branch." The fire in the stove gave a single crack. "And that loan comes up for renewal in March." No one said anything else. Delaney still held the pot and didn't turn around. In the dark window pane before her, she saw the man's face, and she watched it change. It wasn't the fear people showed when someone threatened them. It was the look of a man who had just realized he had stepped into a room he had no right to enter, and was calculating how many steps remained between him and the door. He didn't ask who the man was. That was the detail Delaney remembered for years afterward, that the man hadn't asked a single question. He looked down at the bed for another 2 seconds or so, then muttered something about reviewing the file. He left and closed the door gently behind him. She heard his car start in the driveway. Then the sound of his tires grinding over the snow grew fainter until it disappeared entirely. Delaney remained exactly where she was. She turned on the faucet, rinsed the pot, dried it inside and out with a towel, hung it on the hook above the stove, then wiped her hands and finally turned around. The man on the bed had closed his eyes and looked as though he had never spoken at all. "Don't do that again in this house," she said. He opened his eyes. "Do you want him to come back?" "No," Delaney said. "I want you to understand something. You were lying flat on your back in that bed, unable to sit up by yourself, unable to walk to the door on your own, and you still made a man leave my house in 30 seconds with 3 sentences. So now I don't know what else you're capable of, and I don't know who might come knocking on my door because of it, and I don't like the feeling of not knowing." He looked at her for a long while, and in the firelight rising from the stove, his face looked pale, hollow, and far more exhausted than his voice had sounded moments before. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." Then he added, more quietly, and it was the first thing that evening for which she hadn't been prepared. "You stood there and finished washing that pot before you spoke to me. You aren't as afraid of me as you were of him." 3 days later, Renwick arrived in the morning carrying a file clipped inside a stiff cover. He set it on the edge of the bed without saying anything, then went out to the porch to smoke in the cold, so he wouldn't have to be in the room while it was being read. Delaney saw the file and knew at once what it was, but she didn't say a word. She went behind the house and split firewood for 40 minutes, and when she returned, the file was closed and lying face down on the blanket. The man in the bed didn't ask whether she was angry. He asked her something else. "You owe $9,000 in medical bills from your mother's care," he said. "You haven't paid a single dollar in 3 years. You drive a car with nearly 300,000 miles on it, and there's $3,000 on that cabinet that my men left the morning after I arrived, and you haven't touched it." He turned his head to look at her. I want to know why. Delaney walked to the cabinet, picked up the envelope, and slowly counted the money again in front of him. Then she took out 6 bills and placed the rest on the edge of the bed beside the file. 600, she said. That covers 2 weeks of room and board at the same rate I charge anyone who lies in that bed. And I entered it in the ledger with the date. The other 2,400 is there because of who you are, and I won't take it. He didn't reach for the money. I could tell you it isn't there because of who I am. You could, Delaney said. But if you were lying here and your name was Ulmer, there wouldn't be $3,000 on that cabinet. She pulled out the chair and sat down, resting both hands in her lap. My mother left me 3 things before she died. She didn't write a will, and she had nothing to leave except this house and a box full of seashells. But she repeated those 3 things until I knew them by heart. I want you to hear all 3 because you just spent 3 days looking into me, and you still don't know what kind of person I am. The first was to write everything down. The name, the date, what I did, what I gave, and how it turned out. And the cases I failed were to be written down first, and described at greater length than all the others. She said a ledger filled with nothing but victories was a ledger no one would believe, and the first person who wouldn't believe it would be me, on the day I needed it most. The second was never to take a single dollar from someone who couldn't afford to pay. Not one small coin, not a dozen eggs, not one full tank of gas. She said the day money entered this work would be the day I had something to explain, and I wouldn't be able to explain it because there was no way to explain it at all. The third was to call emergency services every time it was truly their job. Call in front of someone else so there would be a witness who saw me make the call. Call even when I knew for certain they would arrive too late. Call even when I knew for certain I could do better than the person who was coming. She told me there would be a day when people came looking for me, and they would come, and when that day arrived, this would be the only thing standing between me and a place I didn't want to go. She sat quietly for a moment. I've kept all 3 of those rules for 6 years. I haven't broken any of them for anyone, and I won't break the second one for you. The man in the bed stared at the ceiling for a long time. Outside, they could hear Renwick stamping his feet against the porch boards to keep warm. Raphael Corsetti, he said. I'm 34 years old. My father died last spring, and I came home to take over what he left behind. On paper, that means 22 freight warehouses, a concrete contracting company, and 2 riverfront casinos. All of them are real, all of them pay taxes, and all of them employ real people. Beneath the paperwork, my family has spent 3 generations doing the things you can probably imagine. I won't sit here and tell you about every one of them, and I won't tell you I haven't been involved. He didn't turn his face away. He didn't lower his voice, and he didn't add a single word to soften what he had just said. I'm telling you because you just handed back $2,400 while owing $9,000, and I think anyone capable of doing that should at least know who she's caring for. Delaney rose, picked up the envelope, and returned it to the cabinet, in exactly the same place and exactly the same position as before. I figured it out the night that man came here, she said, but thank you for saying it aloud. On the 6th night, she heard the blanket dragging and the rhythm of his breathing change. By the time she reached the doorway of the back room, he had managed to brace himself on one elbow, and his face had gone gray in the firelight. She didn't raise her voice. She walked over, pulled the wooden chair close to the edge of the bed, sat down, and came straight to the point. What's at Ridgeline? He lay still for about 4 seconds, then slowly lowered himself back onto the pillow and released a long breath. He didn't ask how she knew that name. Did you hear it from Renwick? I didn't hear it from anyone, Delaney said. The night they carried you in here, you were driving along Barnstock Road at nearly 10 o'clock, alone in the middle of an ice storm, without telling anyone. Between your house and the place where you crashed, there's exactly one thing on that road worth a man like you driving out to sea in the dark, and everyone in this valley knows what it is. The old cold storage warehouse on Old Quarry Road closed a long time ago, but vehicles still come and go there at night. I've never said anything about it to anyone because it isn't my business, and because the people driving those vehicles are people whose children I've cared for. He turned his head to look at her, and this time he studied her longer than he ever had before. $41,000 a month, he said. That's how much my company is paying for a facility that's no longer operating. I discovered it last spring when I sat down and reviewed my father's books. It was listed under maintenance and operations, and it was a perfectly ordinary expense for a cold storage warehouse because if you don't keep the compressors running in a facility like that, the system fails, and you can never reopen it. So someone is stealing, Delaney said. No, he said the word cleanly and with finality, and for the first time that night, his voice sharpened. That's exactly what I don't understand. No one is stealing. Someone is being paid, and everything is clean. There's an invoice for every month. There are signed maintenance reports. Renwick went up there twice and walked the entire grounds. The compressors really are running. The cold rooms are holding the proper temperatures. And the 4 men who work there are real men. Their names are on the payroll, and they pay taxes. I had people examine every number for 4 straight months, and they couldn't find a single dollar going where it shouldn't. Every cent ends up exactly where it's supposed to go. The firewood settled inside the stove. I questioned 3 people, he continued. The operations manager, the man in charge of the property, and 1 other man. I received 3 very good answers. Every one of them made sense. Every one was supported by paperwork, and none of them contradicted the others. Have you ever asked 3 people 3 questions and received 3 perfect answers? I have, Delaney said. Once, someone in the house was drinking, and all 3 children told the same story. Then you understand. He stared at the ceiling. One day, I grew tired of perfect answers. I didn't call anyone or tell anyone. I went out, got into my car, and drove there myself, and I didn't tell a single person where I was going. Delaney sat quietly for a moment. Then she stood, picked up the fire poker, stirred the coals, and spoke without turning around. I'm going to tell you 4 things, and then I'm turning out the lights. The first is that I don't know what those vehicles are carrying, and I won't guess, because guessing is how people put themselves in an early grave. The second is that, whatever it is, it matters enough that someone didn't want you to reach that place that night, and you didn't reach it. The third, and I need you to listen to this more carefully than the other 3, is that I'm a 28-year-old woman living alone in a house with an unlocked door. I have no license, no title, and no one standing behind me. If anything happens in this kitchen during the next 10 days, there isn't a person in this country who'll believe my account of what happened. Not the police, not a court, not the newspapers. People will believe you, or they'll believe your men, or they'll believe whoever comes afterward. No one will believe me. She set down the poker. And the fourth is that I haven't left this yard in 6 days. There are 9 people in this valley waiting for me, and one of them is Hollis Vance, and he doesn't have much time left to wait. Warren Pike arrived in the middle of the following morning, carrying an enamel pot with a chipped handle, wrapped in 2 layers of bath towels. He carried it in both hands as though it were something fragile, and before setting it on the table, he touched the side to make sure it was still warm. My wife made it last night, he said. She says chicken soup made the night before always tastes better the next day. I've been arguing with her about it for 30 years, and I haven't won once. He took off his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, then pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down, leaning slightly forward. He remained there for 40 minutes. He didn't say a single word about business. He asked about the leg the way people asked about the weather, then moved on to Sanders Lake and the bass Raphael had caught when he was 10 years old. The fish Warren swore was still the largest ever pulled from that water. Raphael said it had been no bigger than his hand, and Warren Pike said that was because the boy remembered it wrong, while he had a photograph to prove it. He told the story of Raphael's father standing in Warren's backyard and making the 2 boys stack bricks in a straight line because he couldn't tolerate anything crooked. He told the story of the summer the boy had to wash his car to pay for the ruined clutch. And he laughed, and the sound of his laughter made the whole kitchen feel a little warmer. Delaney stood at the sink peeling potatoes and listened to every word. She thought that in all her 6 years of walking into houses where someone lay bedridden, she had never seen anyone sit beside a sickbed as well as this man did. Before leaving, Warren stood, put on his coat, then walked over to her and took her hand once more. You remember to take care of yourself, he said. When the caregiver goes down, the whole household goes down with her. Eat enough, sleep whenever you can, and leave that pot here. I'll bring another one next week and trade you for it. He put on his hat, nodded to Renwick, who was standing in the corner of the kitchen, and walked out. The door closed behind him. The porch boards creaked. Then came the sound of a car door, and then the engine faded away along Millrace Road. Raphael Corsetti lay still for 3 seconds. Then he spoke, and not a single note of his voice had changed from when he had been laughing about the bass. Renwick. Yes, sir. Replace every lock at the Chester warehouse. Tonight. Have it finished before morning. He continued staring at the ceiling. Don't tell anyone, not even your men. Renwick stood frozen in the corner of the kitchen. He had worked for this family for 19 years, and his face almost never changed. But Delaney was standing where she could see him, reflected in the dark window pane, and she saw him falter for exactly 1 beat before he answered. Yes, he said. I'll do it. Then he picked up his hat and went outside. Delaney stood at the sink with both hands still wet. She didn't turn around, and she didn't ask a single question. She finished rinsing the potatoes, poured out the water, dried her hands on her apron, and left the pot of soup untouched on the table until afternoon. After dinner, Raphael asked to read the ledgers. She stood watching him for a moment, then walked to the shelf beside the stove. She didn't give him the outermost book. She pulled out the fourth one, its spine worn and a water stain spreading across the upper corner, and placed it on the blanket. "Read from the beginning," she said. "Don't skip ahead. My mother said anyone who skips through a ledger will misunderstand everything by the time they finish." He opened it. The first page of the fourth book wasn't about a life she had saved. It was about a 52-year-old man in Vance Hollow. His full name was there, along with the date, the time she arrived, the time she called emergency services, the name of the person standing beside her when she made the call, and everything she had done in the exact order she had done it. At the bottom were 4 lines written far more slowly than the rest. The pen pressed harder into the paper. In those lines, she had written that she had spent too much time on something that didn't matter, and that, if she could do it again, she would act differently. Then she had written precisely what she would do differently. The second page was the same. So was the third. Raphael turned the pages slowly and read every word. He read throughout the evening, even after Delaney turned off the large light and left only the small table lamp burning. And still he continued. 31 names like those were scattered through the 7 ledgers. Every one of them had been written down before anything else. Every one was longer than the other entries, and she had never hidden a single one of those pages from anyone who entered that house. On Monday morning, she went out to tend to the 9 names still waiting, and the 4th name on the list was Grandma Slade at the end of Gorge Road, a 79-year-old woman who had sprained her wrist at the beginning of winter and still needed to keep it wrapped for another 2 weeks. The Slade kitchen was small, with a low ceiling, and a tire company calendar hung on the wall, open to the wrong month. Ruth Ann Slade opened the door for her, took her bag, and poured coffee without asking whether she wanted any because, in 6 years, Delaney had come to this kitchen often enough that no one needed to ask anymore. At the far end of the table, a 6-year-old girl sat coloring, her hair tied into 2 bunches and her legs swinging above the floor. In front of her lay a coloring book and a box of colored pencils tipped onto its side. Delaney removed the old bandage from the elderly woman's wrist and began wrapping it again from the bottom upward. The little girl colored for a while longer, then slid from her chair, ran into the back room, and returned carrying a seashell in both hands. "Miss Delaney, guess." She placed the shell on the table beside Delaney's elbow, turned its pointed end toward her, and stood up very straight, wearing a solemn expression. "Guess how many spirals it has." Delaney bent closer to look while her hands continued wrapping. The shell was as large as a fist, cream-colored with a pink tint around its opening, its spiral tight and even, with a small serrated ridge along its outer edge. 4, she said. "Wrong." 5. "Wrong again. Then I give up." 6, the little girl cried, holding up 6 fingers. Then she reconsidered and curled one back, only to hold up all 6 again. "My daddy brought it home for me. He said he found it in a place with lots and lots of seabirds, and they fly low over the water like this." She stretched out both arms and leaned first to one side, then the other. Then she pressed the shell to her ear, closed one eye, and went silent for about 3 seconds before her face lit up. "I can hear the waves. It's true, Miss Delaney. You listen." Delaney tied the final knot, wiped her hands on a towel, then picked up the shell and pressed it to her ear. She listened with great care, as though it were the most important thing she would do that morning. "They're there," she said. "Big waves, too." The little girl burst out laughing and hugged the shell in both hands. Delaney told her that the next time she came, she would bring her another one. That one would be white instead of pink, with spines around the outside. The little girl asked when, and Delaney said next week. She asked how many days away next week was, and her grandmother said 7 days. The child sat down, counted 7 fingers, then went back to coloring. Delaney looked up and saw Ruth Ann Slade standing at the end of the table, watching her. The 36-year-old woman didn't say anything. She looked at Delaney much longer than was normal, long enough to make Delaney uncomfortable, without understanding why. Then Ruth Ann reached out and moved the table lamp on the cabinet about 4 inches toward the elderly woman's wrist, so that the light fell directly on the place where Delaney was working. She did it slowly, then turned away to pour more coffee, and didn't speak another word until Delaney left. That night, the telephone in Delaney's house rang. She picked it up and said hello twice, but no one answered. There was no music, no sound of a car, and no second person. There was only breathing, steady and unhurried. It continued for about 7 seconds. Then the caller hung up. The next night, the telephone rang again at around the same time. It rang on the 3rd night too. She didn't tell Raphael, she didn't tell Renwick or Otis Barrow, and she didn't write it in her ledger because that book was for recording what she did for other people, not what happened to her. What she did was drag the heaviest wooden chair in the kitchen beneath the front doorknob, check the back door latch twice, switch on the porch light, and leave it burning all night, even though she had counted every penny of that month's electric bill. Then she took out a blanket and sat in the old armchair beside his bed. She sat there for 3 nights in a row, and on the 3rd night, he woke and found her there. He didn't ask why. He only said, very quietly, "Miss Kovach, what are you waiting for?" And she answered, "Daylight." On the 4th night, the telephone didn't ring, and Delaney understood at once that this was what she needed to worry about. She sat in the armchair with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders and her eyes open. Before dawn, she heard tires grinding slowly over the snow at the top of Millrace Road, then falling silent. She rose, went to the kitchen window, and lifted the burlap curtain just enough to see through a narrow gap. About 200 yards from her house, where the road turned away from the main highway, 2 cars were parked, one behind the other. Their lights were off. Their engines were still running because 2 streams of white exhaust rose behind them and dissolved at once into the cold air. Neither car had license plates. She watched them for about half a minute, and no one got out. She let the curtain fall, walked to the telephone mounted on the wall beside the refrigerator, and didn't call the police because the nearest station was 26 miles away. The night shift had only 1 patrol car for the entire county, and she knew that better than anyone else in the valley. She called Otis Barrow. He answered on the 2nd ring, his voice still thick with sleep, and she said 9 words. "Otis, there are 2 strange cars at my road." There was 1 beat of silence on the other end. Then she heard bare feet touch a wooden floor, and he said, "Stay inside the house. Don't go out on the porch." Otis Barrow was 52 years old, owned a towing and recovery shop, and had served as captain of the town's volunteer fire department for 14 years. The department had an emergency text chain used whenever there was a fire or the river began to rise, and that chain reached 47 telephone numbers within seconds. Sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, he typed a single line, "Millrace Road. Not a fire. Bring your trucks." Delaney stood beside the window and heard the first engine start in the direction of the general store. Then came a second from near the church. Then 3 engines started at once from the direction of Gorge Road. Within about 9 minutes, 11 pickup trucks were lined across Millrace Road below the 2 unfamiliar cars, their front ends turned toward one another, and every headlight burning. Their white beams cut through the sideways snow, forming a wall of light that stretched from the fence on one side of the road to the fence on the other. Then people began getting out. They didn't gather in a group or speak to one another, and no one waved a flashlight around. They stood in a loose line in front of their own trucks, hands tucked into pockets or hanging at their sides. The breath of 40 people rose white in the headlight beams and drifted away. Wendell Krupa was there, the welder from the bridge repair shop, still wearing his work coveralls. 2 tanker drivers from the dairy company stood beside each other without hats. 2 retired school teachers from Chapel Road were there, one wearing a bathrobe over her sweater, standing close together as though they were waiting for a bus. 70-year-old Mr. Dorsey held a wooden baseball bat that the whole town knew he couldn't use to hit anyone. He held it with the end pointed toward the ground, and his hand was trembling from the cold and nothing else. One woman had brought a thermos of coffee. She set it on the hood of a truck and folded her arms. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. Otis Barrow stood in the middle of the line in front of his tow truck, and he said nothing either. The door of the unfamiliar car farther up the road opened, and 2 men stepped out. They stood in the snow, one of them keeping a hand on the open door. They looked down the road. They looked at the wall of headlights, then at the 40 people standing motionless in those beams, and staring directly back at them. No one raised a hand, and no one stepped away. It lasted for about 20 seconds. Then the man nearest the car door said something very brief to the other man. Both of them got back inside. The car farther up the road reversed, turned around in 3 movements on the narrow pavement, and both vehicles drove down to the main highway and disappeared. No one followed them. Otis Barrow remained there for another 5 minutes to make certain, then raised one hand. The 11 pickup trucks backed away one by one. People climbed inside and drove home, and still no one said anything. In the house at the end of the road, Raphael Corsetti lay on the low bed beside the stove and heard everything. He heard the engines gathering, heard the car doors closing one after another, heard the long silence in the middle, then heard the engines scattering again. He had sat in 3 conference rooms where one sentence from him had made 6 people rise at the same moment. He had paid for loyalty, bought it, and renewed it every quarter. And as he lay there in the darkness, He understood the thing that kept him awake until morning. 40 people had just climbed out of bed in the middle of the night and driven there to stand in the road before dawn, and not one of them had come because of him. The next morning, he said nothing about the night before. He waited until she set down his bowl of oatmeal, then said, "Miss Kovash, let me borrow the telephone." She unhooked the cord from the wall, pulled the coiled wire out to its full length, and placed the receiver on the stool beside his bed. Then she returned to the sink and began scrubbing the enamel pot Warren Pike had left behind. The first call lasted less than 3 minutes. He offered no greeting and asked after no one. He named a company, gave the month and year of a loan, and said the entire amount would be called in by the end of the week. The person on the other end gave a long response. Raphael listened to all of it, then said, "You have 4 days," and hung up. The second call lasted longer. There was the name of a project, the name of a county, and the figure $2 million, spoken only once and without emphasis. He said the contract wasn't to be signed, that if it had already been signed, it would be withdrawn, and that he didn't care how large the penalty was. The person on the other end asked him to repeat himself. Raphael repeated precisely what he had just said, without adding or removing a single word, and the way he repeated it word for word was colder than shouting would have been. Then he dialed the third call. This one was the shortest. He said nothing except a person's name and an address on Hazel Road, then hung up. Delaney finished scrubbing the pot. She rinsed it twice, set it upside down on the rack, dried both hands with a towel 1 finger at a time, hung the towel on its hook, then turned around. "What was the third call?" "You don't need to know." "I do." She walked over and stood about 5 feet from the foot of the bed. She didn't fold her arms, and she didn't raise her voice. "Because if someone doesn't come home tonight, then it began in my kitchen, on my telephone, the telephone my mother had installed while she was still alive, with the number this whole valley calls when someone falls. And while it was happening, I stood exactly where I'm standing now and washed a pot." She paused. "You don't have to explain what kind of work you do. You've already told me, and I listened. But you aren't allowed to turn this house into the place where something like that begins. This is the only place in 6 counties where people can knock on the door at midnight and know for certain that someone will answer. It took me 6 years to make that true, and I won't let you destroy it in 4 minutes." Raphael Corsetti looked at her. He looked longer than he ever had before, long enough that she could clearly hear the clock on top of the refrigerator and the snow sliding from the metal roof of the shed outside. In his life, people had argued with him, pleaded with him, cried in front of him, and a few had tried to buy him. No one had ever stood 5 feet away with freshly dried hands and told him he wasn't allowed. Then he reached for the telephone, dialed the number he had just called, and when someone answered, he said exactly 4 words. "Drop the whole thing." He listened for 2 seconds. "There's no reason." "Drop it." Then he set down the receiver and didn't look at her again. Renwick arrived at noon. He stood in his usual corner of the kitchen, and Raphael made his 4th call. This one wasn't made over the telephone. He delivered it directly to the face of the man who had worked for his family for 19 years. "Pull every one of our men out of this valley. All of them. Today." Renwick straightened. "Sir, after what happened last night, I recommend the opposite. I recommend bringing in 4 more men. Pull them all out. I don't want one of our cars on this road again. None parked at the general store, none parked out on the main highway, and no one walking past that fence. Allow me to ask one more time, just to be certain." "You heard me clearly." Raphael stared at the ceiling. "If anything happens here, I don't want any of my men standing close enough to be photographed with her. This isn't to protect me. She has nothing, Renwick. She has no license, no lawyer, and no one behind her. The only thing she has is the 40 people who came out into the road for her last night, and that will disappear within a week if people see my cars parked in front of her house." Renwick didn't ask a third time. He put on his hat and went outside. Delaney stood on the other side of the doorway to the back room, and she had heard everything from the beginning. She didn't step out immediately. She waited until she heard Renwick's car leave the yard, then poured coffee into the white ceramic cup with the chip along its rim, carried it over, set it on the stool beside Raphael's bed, and went outside to split firewood. It was his 2nd cup of the day. In all the weeks he had lain there, she had never poured a 2nd cup for anyone before. The neighbor's boy came running up Millrace Road late that afternoon and said Mrs. Vance needed her to come at once. Delaney had known this day was coming since the previous fall, so she simply picked up her bag and went. There were 4 people in the room at the house in Vance Hollow. Marlene sat at the head of the bed. Their eldest son leaned against the doorframe and wouldn't step inside. The brother-in-law sat in a kitchen chair that had been carried into the room, and a neighbor stood in the corner, holding his hat. Delaney set her bag on the floor and didn't open it because there was nothing left inside that could help. and she had known that for 3 weeks. She sat on the right side of the bed and remained there for 2 hours. She wiped the area around his mouth with a damp cloth. She did that 7 times in those 2 hours. She slipped one hand beneath his neck and adjusted the pillow to raise his head by about an inch, then adjusted it again a little while later. She pulled the left edge of the blanket back into place after it slipped down. She took his wrist and held it, but she didn't count his pulse. She simply held on. When the light outside the window began to dim, she leaned close to his ear and said, "It's dark now, Mr. Vance. The yard light is on." She said it because, back in October, he had told her that what frightened him most wasn't pain, but not knowing what time it was. He had asked that if someone was there, they please tell him whether it was light or dark outside. And Delaney had written those words in her ledger that very night, under the list of things she needed to do for him. Marlene didn't cry. Their son stepped outside once, then returned. The neighbor in the corner turned his hat slowly in his hands. Hollis Vance passed away a little more than an hour later, and Delaney was still holding his wrist when it happened. She remained still for a while before lowering his hand onto the blanket. Then she finished everything that still needed to be done. She moved slowly, and no one in the room said anything. It was fully dark by the time she reached the driveway. Marlene Vance followed her outside and stood beside Delaney's old car in the cold without a coat. When Delaney opened the car door, Marlene caught hold of her sleeve. "Miss Kovach, there's something I have to tell you. I've been waiting 6 days to say it, and now I can't wait any longer." Delaney closed the car door again. "Back in the fall, someone came up to the house asking for him," Marlene said. "They weren't offering him work. They wanted him to go up to the cold storage warehouse on Old Quarry Road and look at the shelving in chamber number 2, because he had worked there for 7 years, and no one left in this county remembered that warehouse as well as he did. He was gone for about 2 hours. They gave him $60, and he took it because we were short on money for heating oil." She was still holding Delaney's sleeve. "He came home and didn't say anything for 2 days. He still ate and watched television, but he didn't speak. I knew him, miss. When he was like that, he was thinking. Then, on the 3rd night, he was sitting at the kitchen table, and he said this to me." She stopped, then spoke the next words slowly, using her husband's voice instead of her own. "Marlene, those cold rooms up there are running at full capacity, but there's nothing inside them. The shelves are empty. The floors are clean. I went into chamber number 2 and chamber number 3. Both were being kept at exactly the right temperature, but there wasn't a single crate of goods inside either one. People don't spend money cooling empty air. They keep the rooms cold, so the temperature gauges have numbers to record." Delaney stood in the Vance driveway and felt the cold travel along both her arms. Marlene released her sleeve. "He didn't say anything else, and I didn't ask. That was the warehouse's business, not my family's." Delaney kept the story to herself for 2 days. She didn't tell Raphael that night, and she didn't tell him the following day. She slept little, completed everything she needed to do, and sat at the kitchen table in the evening with her ledger open before her, unable to write a single line. On the morning of the 3rd day, she drove back to Vance Hollow. Marlene opened the door and assumed she had come about the funeral. "No, ma'am," Delaney said. "I've come to ask your permission." Standing on the doorstep, she told Marlene plainly who the man lying in her house was, that the warehouse belonged to his family, and that what Hollis Vance had said at the kitchen table that night might be the most important thing in the entire matter. "But you told me. You didn't tell him. You told me 4 hours after your husband died, outside in the driveway, and I've spent 2 days trying to decide whether I have the right to carry those words elsewhere. I don't believe I do, unless you say I do." Marlene Vance stood in the doorway for a long time. "Hollis coughed for that factory for 11 years, she said. "It never gave him anything. Take it with you. If it can give him this one thing, he would have liked that very much." For the next 3 weeks, Delaney got nowhere. Renwick obtained the electronic trip logs from the 2 refrigerated trucks bearing the Ridgeline name, and he brought the printouts to her kitchen and laid them on the table. Delaney spread them out beside her mother's old county map, a paper map whose folds had split in 4 places and which bore a coffee stain in the lower right corner. The number was right there, and it refused to move. The trucks left the yard after dark and returned before dawn. Every trip lasted 9.5 hours in total. Every time, every month. From Kettle Bend to the Port of Baltimore was 218 miles. A refrigerated truck carrying freight over hill roads at night could manage no more than about 45 miles per hour. That meant nearly 5 hours each way and 10 hours for the round trip, without including time to load or unload, without a break, and without stopping for fuel. 9.5 hours wasn't enough. It wasn't merely insufficient. It fell short by so much that there was no possible way to explain it. and the same driver made 2 trips every week, something the hours of service laws wouldn't allow if the actual distance were truly that long. Delaney sat before that map for 14 evenings. She measured with a length of wool yarn, marked routes with a pencil, and calculated the journey again and again in 3 different ways. All 3 methods gave her the same result. There had to be a place in between. The trucks weren't going to the ocean. They were traveling somewhere else, unloading or picking something up, then turning back. That place had to lie about 100 miles away. She marked 11 names along that route and managed to ask questions at 7 of them, but none led anywhere. On the 14th evening, she sat down with a cup of cold coffee and remembered a 6-year-old child standing beside a kitchen table, holding up 6 fingers. My daddy said he found it in a place with lots and lots of seabirds. Delaney sat upright. Then she rose, went into the back room, pulled her mother's wooden box from beneath the bed, and placed it on the table. After the funeral, when there was nothing left to do in the house and she could no longer bear to sit still, she had emptied the entire box onto the living room floor and spent a whole night sorting every shell by type. Her mother had collected them for more than 20 years in different places, and she remembered where every one of them had come from. Delaney had wanted to preserve that memory somewhere beyond her mother's mind. Attached to the inside of the lid was a sheet of graph paper her mother had filled out in ballpoint pen and divided into columns. Delaney had read it so many times that she no longer needed to read it. She lifted the lid and found the entry in the second column. A shell with 6 spirals, a pink-tinted opening, and a serrated ridge around the outer edge. That species didn't live along the open coast. It lived in brackish water inside estuaries, and in the north, it was found only around the Chesapeake estuary. Her mother's box contained 3 of them. All 3 had been collected in the same place, and her mother had written the name of that place in the neighboring column. Delaney rose from the table, returned to the map, and placed 1 finger on the road running southeast out of the county. She followed it until it began descending into the lowlands. 98 miles, 4 hours and 15 minutes each way when driven slowly at night. 8.5 hours there and back, leaving 1 hour for loading and unloading. 9.5 hours. She put on her coat, pulled on her boots, and went to her car after darkness had fully settled, without telling Raphael where she was going. 40 minutes later, she knocked on the door of August Renwick's house at the edge of Uniontown. He opened it wearing a sweater and slacks, his reading glasses still in one hand, and froze on the threshold when he saw her. "Miss Kovac, I'm going to ask you one question, then I'll leave," Delaney said. She didn't step inside. "The Larkin Transfer Yard, the one off Route 44 below Garrett County. Who's leasing it?" August Renwick stood in the hallway of his house without moving. He had managed property for that family for 19 years and knew every yard, every warehouse, and every parcel of land. He knew that name without needing to consult a ledger, and Delaney saw the knowledge pass across his face. "Larkin is leased to a Mr. C. Whitcomb," he said. "It has been for 4 years. He pays on time every quarter." Renwick set his glasses on the small table beside the door, and his hand wasn't entirely steady. "His name has been in my ledger for 4 years, miss, and I've never met the man once." Renwick returned the following afternoon, carrying what Delaney assumed was a document box, until he opened it. Inside lay a small black leather notebook, the kind made to fit in a breast pocket, its cover worn smooth at all 4 corners. "It was in the safe at the old house in Ligonier," Renwick said. "I went there to retrieve the insurance papers, and found this at the bottom. I hadn't read more than 3 pages when I stopped. I brought it down here because I think you should be the one to read it, not me." Raphael opened the notebook. The handwriting belonged to his father, small, even capital letters slanting slightly to the right. The hand of a man who had once been a warehouse clerk before he had become anything else. Most of it consisted of brief entries without context, initials, figures, and dates. Then, about a third of the way through the notebook, there was a page containing only 3 lines, written apart from one another like a list meant to be remembered. The first said that the route had to avoid every hospital with an operating emergency room. The second said there could be no county medical examiner's office within a 40-mile radius. The third contained only 4 words, and Raphael read them 3 times. "No one keeps count." He sat propped against the pillows with the notebook open in his lap, and said nothing for a long time. Delaney stood at the sink and saw that his shoulders didn't move. Renwick stood in the corner of the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and he said nothing either. Those 3 lines weren't notes about concealing cargo. They were criteria for choosing a location. Kettlebend hadn't simply become entangled in this. Kettlebend had been chosen. Chosen precisely because the hospital down in town had closed. Because the nearest emergency room was 38 minutes away when the roads were dry. Because the medical examiner's office lay beyond the required radius. because there wasn't a single agency in those 6 counties sitting down to count how many people failed to wake up in the morning. They weren't moving cargo through a valley because it was quiet. They were moving it through a valley because no one was watching. And the one thing the man who wrote those 3 lines hadn't accounted for was a woman sitting at her kitchen table every night with a ballpoint pen and a hardbound ledger, writing down every name, including the names of those she couldn't save, writing them first, and writing more about them than anyone else, for 6 straight years, simply because her mother had told her she must. Raphael closed his father's notebook. Then he reached toward the shelf beside the stove. This time he didn't ask permission. He pulled out the outermost ledger, the 7th one, the book with the refusal of transport form tucked between its final 2 pages. He began turning the pages backward from the end. He had read 4 of the ledgers over the past several weeks, and had grown familiar with Delaney's handwriting. Small, plain letters, every line as straight as if it had been drawn with a ruler. But near the end of the 7th ledger, there was another hand. It slanted more sharply. The pressure of the pen was uneven, the letters were rounder, and in some places the writer had crossed out a word and written it again beside the first. It appeared intermittently across about 20 pages, interspersed among pages written by Delaney. Whenever it appeared, it followed precisely the same pattern. Name, date, time, what had been done, whom the writer had called, and the outcome. "Miss Kovac," he said. She dried her hands and came over. He turned the ledger around so she could see it. "This isn't your handwriting." Delaney looked down at the page and stood motionless. "That was Junie," she said. "My younger sister." She was 19. "On the nights when I worked my shift at the warehouse, if someone came calling, she answered the door. She could do the simple things, change a bandage, take blood pressure, and call emergency services if necessary. I taught her to record everything exactly the way my mother taught me. She kept the ledger for me for about a year. She said nothing more. She didn't say in which season those entries had stopped, and Raphael didn't ask. He continued turning the pages backward, slowly, until he reached the last page bearing that handwriting. It described an ordinary case, a man whose wrist had been scalded by boiling water. The burn had been washed and bandaged, and he had been told to return in 2 days. At the bottom of the page, following the established pattern, the writer had recorded the name of the person who had brought the patient to the house. Raphael Corsetti read that name. Then he read it a second time. Delaney had returned to the sink and was arranging bowls in the rack, and she didn't see his face. Renwick did. Renwick took half a step forward, then stopped. That name appeared on the 9th line of the payroll for the facility on Old Quarry Road. Raphael had read that payroll 4 times the previous spring, and he remembered every line. He didn't close the ledger. He sat there with it open in his lap, his right hand resting across the page, and remained that way until Delaney had finished putting away the dishes and turned off the kitchen light. Renwick brought the cross-reference 4 days later. It was a list of the batch codes that had passed through the facility on Old Quarry Road over 4.5 years, along with the counties that received them. An acquaintance of his in the federal office had provided it after Raphael picked up the telephone and spoke to 2 more people. Raphael spread the list across the blanket and told Delaney to bring him all 7 ledgers. She brought them over and stacked them on the stool. She didn't ask what he intended to do because she had understood the moment she saw that sheet of paper. They worked through the entire evening and most of the night. He read out the batch codes and dates, while she turned the pages and searched for names. Each time they found a match, she marked the place with a small slip of paper tucked into the spine. By well past midnight, 31 slips protruded from the spines of the 7 ledgers. Not 100, not 500. 31 people in 6 years, in a valley of 3,400 residents, and Delaney had recorded every one of them at the beginning of her section, in entries longer than all the others, exactly as her mother had taught her. "Read them to me," Raphael said. She pulled out a chair and sat about 3 feet away from him, resting the stack of ledgers in her lap, and she began to read. She read as though delivering a shift report. Full name, age, date, and 1 brief line about the circumstances. She didn't read faster or slower, and she didn't pause between names. A retired miner on Chapel Road, a woman who worked shifts at the packing plant, a 30-year-old electrician with 2 children, a veteran who lived alone in the mobile home behind the church. She read one name after another, her voice never changing. He didn't interrupt once, and from beginning to end, he stared directly at the ceiling. When she reached the 31st name, she stopped. She didn't stop for long. She paused only for the length of 1 breath in and 1 breath out. "Junie Kovac," she said. 19 years old. She looked down at the page in her hands. She took a pill she believed was real, and she never woke up. I was working my shift at the warehouse. I came home in the morning. She closed the ledger and placed it on top of the stack. She's the only person in these 7 books whose entry I didn't write. I couldn't. I sat at that table for 4 nights with a pen in my hand, and I couldn't write a single word. In the end, I left the page blank, and it's still blank today. The only sound in the room was the fire. Raphael Corsetti lay motionless. He didn't turn his head or say a word, and Delaney could see the tension in his jaw. Then she did something she hadn't been able to do for 14 months. She took the telephone from the pocket of her coat hanging behind the door, opened it, and found the voice message that had remained there since that night. She had changed phones twice since then, and both times she had sat in the telephone shop out on Route 40 and insisted that they transfer that message to the new phone. She had never once pressed play. She placed the telephone on the stool between them and pressed the button. Raphael Corsetti listened. Delaney sat upright in the chair with both hands resting on her knees, staring at a point on the wall behind his head. Her face didn't move once from beginning to end. Then, somewhere near the middle, she closed her eyes and kept them closed. Raphael didn't. He watched her throughout, and at some point in that recording, the man who had driven a debt collector from this kitchen in 30 seconds with 3 sentences had to turn his face away and stare at the wall. The message ended. There was no beep, only a silence that sounded slightly different. Delaney opened her eyes, picked up the telephone, turned off the screen, and returned it to her coat pocket. She stood. She arranged the 7 ledgers into a neat stack, pulled all 31 slips of paper from their spines, gathered them into her palm, and returned the books to the shelf beside the stove, in their proper order. Then she turned back. "Get out of my house," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, and it didn't tremble. "I'll call Mr. Renwick in the morning, and he'll arrange another place for you. That leg can withstand the journey now, and I guarantee you that. But you won't sleep another night in this house." Raphael Corsetti said nothing. He didn't ask why. He didn't say that he hadn't known. He didn't say that it had been his father, not him. All 3 things were true, and he didn't say any of them, nor did he reach for the envelope on the cabinet. He didn't mention the $9,000, the medicine, the firewood, the electricity, or any of the things he had spent his entire life using to settle every problem. He simply nodded once. Renwick arrived the following morning while the light was still dim, and they left. Delaney stood in the kitchen looking through the window until the sound of the car had faded completely. The inspection was scheduled for the following morning at the owner's request, with a state investigator and a county food safety inspector accompanying the team. Everything was in writing. Everything would take place in broad daylight. And those were the conditions Delaney gave Renwick over the telephone before she agreed to tell anyone anything. She made the call reporting it in front of Otis Barrow and the woman who owned the general store out on Route 40. She stated the date and time clearly, then recorded the names of both witnesses in the 7th ledger before hanging up. Everett Sloan knew about the inspection by that afternoon. That night, he drove up to Old Quarry Road to remove 4.5 years of manifest records stored inside the steel cabinet in the inspection room. Raphael Corsetti arrived half an hour before him. He came through the gate on crutches, accompanied by Renwick and Ike Palo, the 61-year-old mechanic from the old garage. None of the 3 carried anything except flashlights. 3 men were waiting in the yard. They weren't Sloan's men. A car parked inside the yard had its headlights aimed directly at the front of the warehouse, and snow flew sideways through the beams in slanting white streaks. A barrel burned for warmth in one corner of the yard, its yellow flames jerking upward whenever the wind slipped through the gap beneath the rolling door. Raphael walked directly into the center of the headlights. He stopped there, resting on his crutches, and didn't raise his voice. "Dale Furrow," he said. "You were born in Mount Braddock. Your wife's name is Sheila. You have 3 children, and the eldest is in 10th grade. The man on the left didn't move. Curtis Renshaw. You grew up in Vanderbilt. Your mother still lives on Bridge Road. Your daughter's name is Bethany. She's 7 years old and attends Fairview Elementary School." That man took one step backward. "And you?" Raphael said to the 3rd man. "I know who you are, but I won't say your name here because your mother still attends Mass at St. Rita, and I don't want that name appearing in tonight's report if it can be avoided." No one said anything. The fire roared and fluttered inside the barrel. Then Dale Furrow turned, walked to the car, and got inside. Curtis Renshaw followed him. The 3rd man remained where he was for 3 seconds, then charged. Boots pounded against the concrete. A body struck the metal rolling door with a sound like a drum. Palo shouted a single word, then someone fell onto the concrete floor. Renwick pinned the man there with one knee, while Palo retrieved Raphael's crutch from where it had been knocked away and handed it back to him. The entire thing lasted less than 10 seconds. Everett Sloan arrived about 20 minutes later. He managed to open the steel cabinet and throw a stack of papers into the burning barrel before Paolo tore the fire extinguisher from its hook on the wall and smothered the flames. The outer edges of the entire stack were scorched, and the top 4 pages were gone, but the rest remained legible, and that was the important part. The red and blue lights of the state police swept across the yard before Sloane reached the gate. Raphael Corsetti sat directly on the warehouse floor with his cast leg stretched out before him, still holding the scorched manifests in one hand. He remained there while people moved around him, and no one asked whether he was all right. Warren Pike was arrested that morning at home, while eating breakfast with his wife at the kitchen table. He didn't resist, didn't immediately call an attorney, and didn't ask a single question. He rose, folded the newspaper, kissed his wife on the forehead, and as he passed through the door, he said one sentence to the investigator walking beside him. The boy was going to shut down the thing that fed his whole family for 3 generations. The question Raphael had carried since the morning he heard the engines gathering at the top of Millrace Road was answered 2 days later in a room containing 3 people and a file. No one had betrayed him. None of Renwick's men had talked. None of the 4 people who knew the address had sold his name. On the night of the ice storm, when the ambulance arrived late and Raphael Corsetti, barely conscious, heard the word hospital, shook his head, and signed the refusal of transport form in a crooked hand, that document had done precisely what it was supposed to do. It had kept his name out of the hospital system. But the ambulance crew worked under contract, and every refusal of transport was entered into an electronic record and sent to the billing entity for verification. The entity responsible for paying that crew was the group insurance company used by the Corsetti Corporation itself. The record contained the date, the patient's condition, and the address where the patient had refused transportation. Warren Pike had overseen the corporation's human resources and benefits division for 9 straight years, and no one had thought to revoke his access when Raphael took control. Warren logged in the following afternoon, just as he had logged in every week for 9 years, and he read the address on Millrace Road. 6 days later, 2 cars without license plates were parked at the top of that road before dawn. The wisest decision Raphael Corsetti made that night, a decision made when he barely knew where he was the very thing that had nearly gotten him killed. Ike Paolo was the one who finally said it aloud, and he did so on the 2nd afternoon after the night at Ridgeline, standing in his garage with both hands covered in motor oil and unable to look anyone directly in the eye. He said he had kept it to himself for 11 weeks. He said that on the night of the ice storm, he hadn't been the one who inspected the boss's truck before the boss left. He hadn't towed the vehicle back to the yard, and he hadn't authorized anyone else to tow it back. Yet the following morning it was sitting in the yard with its front end crushed. He said he had opened the fuse box to look inside, and found the cover sitting crooked, with fresh tool marks around the fuel pump relay socket. He said he had held that cover in his hand and couldn't think of a single explanation that didn't sound insane, so he closed it again and told no one for 11 weeks. Micah Slade was 22 years old, an assistant mechanic in that garage, and Denny Slade's younger brother. He was called in to give a statement, and he talked for 9 minutes. He had never taken a cent from anyone. What he knew came from something his brother had told him after 4 beers in their backyard the previous summer, and he hadn't repeated a single word of it to anyone since. On the night of the ice storm, Raphael Corsetti walked into the garage after darkness had fully fallen. He was in a hurry and alone, and he went straight to the pickup without calling for Paolo. The only person inside the garage was a 22-year-old boy, holding a flashlight beside the cold workbench. Raphael spoke to him casually, the way people spoke to someone they weren't truly thinking about, and said he was going up to Ridgeline for a little while, and that Micah wasn't to tell anyone. "Then what did you do, Micah?" the investigator asked. "I pulled the relay, sir." 4 seconds. He did it in 4 seconds, standing right there while the other man walked around toward the driver's door. Micah calculated that the truck would stall after about a mile, on the uphill grade leading out of town. Raphael would have to call someone. He would be angry, and no one would go up to Ridgeline that night. Micah didn't think beyond the next hour. The truck stalled after 1 3/4 miles. It died while moving through the curve below Culver, in the middle of black ice, and when the engine shut off, the power steering went with it. Later, after the whole town had learned what happened, and 4 people had transported a man 22 miles through the night, the 22-year-old boy rode his bicycle back up there in the dark. He found the pickup lying on its side beside the road, opened the fuse box, returned the relay to its proper place, then called a towing company from outside the county and had the truck hauled back to the yard. That was why the vehicle reached the yard 5.5 hours later than it should have. "I stood in that garage for 11 weeks, Micah Slade said. Every day, someone came in and said he was getting better. Every day, I thought, he's getting better, and I've thought about this over and over, sir. I think that if he'd died that night, I probably would have confessed that same night. I still haven't figured out whether that would have been better or much worse. Everett Sloane's statement, taken 3 days later, contained one detail Micah Slade didn't know and wouldn't learn until his attorney read him a copy of the file. On the night of the ice storm, 2 of Warren Pike's men had been waiting in the darkness behind the old way station on Old Quarry Road since before nightfall. They had received 4 hours of advance notice. They waited until nearly dawn, then left because the truck never arrived. If that pickup had completed those 22 miles, Raphael Corsetti would have reached the place, and he would never have come back down. The boy had pulled the relay for a brother who had never given him a single dollar. Micah Slade was charged with tampering with a vehicle. He was also charged with participating in a criminal organization because he had known since the summer and had remained silent since the summer, and it was that second charge that increased his sentence. He received 6 years. Everett Sloane, the man who had operated the facility for 4.5 years, had an attorney from the first day, and people who taught him how to answer every question. Delaney Kovac wrote to the state parole board that spring. It changed nothing. She wrote again the following spring, then again the spring after that, and she never told anyone. The complaint was filed at the beginning of spring, and the person who filed it was Dr. Curtis Prosser, 63 years old, the only licensed medical practitioner within a 19-mile radius, and the same man who, 3 years earlier, had reported to the nursing board the signatures found in the records of a nurse who had recently died. The complaint listed 14 specific incidents, each with a date, a patient's name, and a description of what had been done. He had prepared it carefully. Under state law, the penalty was $2,000 for each incident. $28,000. Delaney sat at the kitchen table with the document before her and took out her savings book to check the balance, not because she had forgotten the number, but because she wanted to see it with her own eyes. $1,140. Renwick arrived 2 days later. He sat down, placed his hat on his knees, and told her the matter of the fine had already been handled, that his employer had given instructions before the complaint was even filed, and that she didn't need to think about it anymore. Delaney rose from her chair. "No," she said, "and I want you to listen to the entire reason because I'll say it only once, and then I won't say it again. If he pays that $28,000, there won't be another story left in these 6 counties. The story will be that a boss from Pittsburgh paid to make a troublesome matter disappear, and that the woman belongs to him. It'll be told at the barber shop, in the churchyard, and at the coffee counter inside the general store. People won't tell it because they hate me. They'll tell it because it's a good story. And Mr. Renwick, the most frightening thing isn't that they'll tell it. The most frightening thing is that it'll be true. I've been able to do this work for 6 years only because there's exactly one thing no one can say about me. There has never been a single dollar in my hands that anyone could point to. That's everything I have. It isn't kindness. It's the only thing that allows me to keep the right to enter people's kitchens at midnight. If you give me $28,000 today, you'll take that away from me, and you won't be able to give it back. 4 years from now, when someone files a second complaint, there'll be nothing standing between me and the place I don't want to go except him. I can't live that way." Renwick sat quietly for a while. "Then what are you going to do?" "I'm going to answer that complaint," Delaney said, "and I'm going to answer it with 7 ledgers." She didn't learn about the paper at the general store until the 4th day. Otis Barrow walked into the store out on Route 40 one morning and asked the owner for a sheet of graph paper and a pen. He wrote 4 lines across the top and laid it on the counter beside the cash register, in the exact place where people rested their hands while waiting for their change. Those 4 lines said that the person signing below had called Delaney Kovac to their home or to the home of a family member, and that if the court wanted to know what she had done there, the signer was willing to come and say it. No one organized anything. No one canvassed the town. No one made telephone calls. And no one put up a sign. People came in to buy gasoline, milk, or cigarettes. They stood waiting for their change, read those 4 lines, then picked up the pen. By the end of the 4th day, both sides of the paper were full, and the store owner had to attach another sheet. 88 signatures. Wendell Krupa's handwriting was there. The 2 retired teachers from Chapel Road had signed close beside each other. 70-year-old Mr. Dorsey's signature was there, shaky and twice as large as everyone else's. Marlene Vance's name was there. There was even the signature of a man from Vance Hollow whose wife Delaney had sat beside for an entire night 3 years earlier and had been unable to save. And in the middle of the back page, between the 9th and 11th lines, was the name Ruth Ann Slade, written in the round, clear hand of a woman who hadn't shortened a single letter, a woman whose husband was awaiting trial because of that very operation, and whose younger brother-in-law had just received 6 years. Otis Barrow brought the paper to Delaney's house that afternoon, placed it on the kitchen table, said he was only leaving it there and didn't mean anything by it, then went home. Delaney sat down and read from top to bottom, finished the front, turned it over, and when she reached the 10th line, she collapsed over the table and wept. The man who agreed to defend her was Abe Strauss, a 68-year-old retired healthcare attorney from Greensburg, who read the story in the county newspaper and drove down on his own. After their first meeting, he told Delaney that she was the most frightening client he had ever represented, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. He refused to accept a single dollar. He also refused to deny anything. "You did those things," he said. "You're going to testify that you did them. We won't dispute one word of those 14 allegations. What we're going to do is place those 7 ledgers on the court's table and make Dr. Prosser explain them." The hearing began at the end of the month, and every seat in the county courtroom was occupied before the clerk called the case. Delaney took the oath and testified, and she testified exactly as Strauss had instructed. She admitted all 14 incidents, one by one, giving the date, the person's name, and what she had done. She didn't add a single word in her own defense. The prosecution presented its case for 2 hours, and there was nothing to dispute because all of it was true. Then the 7 ledgers were brought forward. Strauss stacked them before the judge, and he didn't talk about the people Delaney had saved. He opened the 4th book and read aloud the first page concerning a 52-year-old man. He read the entire entry, including the final 4 lines in which Delaney had written what she had done wrong and what she should have done differently. He closed that ledger, opened the 5th, and read another page, then the 6th, then the 7th. 4 names, 4 people who were no longer alive, read in the even voice of an old man inside a courtroom so silent that nothing stirred. Then he stopped. "Your Honor, these 7 ledgers contain 27 more pages like those. I could read another 11. I don't intend to." He placed one hand on the stack. "Would the court like to read them?" Judge Beatrice Lund, who had occupied that bench for 29 years, pulled the stack toward her. She read for nearly an hour. No one was permitted to leave. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, and she made no attempt to hide it. She instructed the clerk to enter into the record that the court had reviewed the evidence in its entirety. Then Strauss called Dr. Curtis Prosser to the witness stand. He was exceedingly polite to him. He established that the witness had been a licensed medical practitioner for 39 years, that his clinic was 22 miles from Kettle Bend, and that he was the only licensed practitioner within a 19-mile radius. Then he asked 4 questions. "Dr. Prosser, on the night of the ice storm last February, were you called to examine a man with a broken leg?" "Yes." "Did you go?" "I didn't." "Why not?" And Curtis Prosser, 63 years old, a man who had sat in that courtroom hundreds of times as a familiar presence and had never once stood on that witness stand, said, "I wasn't feeling well." Strauss didn't ask another question about that answer. He didn't ask how the doctor had been unwell. He didn't ask whether anyone could verify it. He simply stood still and allowed the answer to remain in the center of the courtroom for 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, not one person in the room moved, and Delaney Kovach would later say that it was the most frightening thing she had ever seen one human being do to another. Then Strauss moved to his 3rd question. "During the past 3 years, how many times have you entered Kettle Bend to examine a patient?" "I don't remember the exact number." "I have your patient records here, doctor." Strauss lifted a blue folder. 7 times. No one said anything. 3,400 people. A town without a hospital. An emergency room 38 minutes away when the roads were dry. And 7 visits in 3 years. Strauss set the blue folder on the table. "Dr. Prosser, my final question. If this court finds the defendant guilty today, and she's required to pay $28,000 she doesn't have, close her home, and leave this county to seek work somewhere else, then who will care for the 3,400 people in Kettle Bend?" The courtroom remained silent for a long time. "That isn't my responsibility, sir, Doctor," Prosser said. "No," Abe Strauss said. "That's correct. That's precisely why I asked." The court found Delaney Kovach guilty, and there was nothing surprising about that, because she had done those things, and she had admitted to them under oath, and no one seated on a judge's bench could pretend that a law of the state didn't exist. All 14 charges were found proven. Then Judge Beatrice Lund set the fine at $1 for each charge. $14. After that, she read a statement that lasted 9 minutes, one the county newspaper printed in full, and 2 major news services quoted the following week. She said the law was the law, and the court had no discretion in the matter of conviction. She said the court had full discretion in determining the penalty, and it had exercised that discretion. She said that in her 29 years on the bench, she had never seen a record like the 7 ledgers placed before her that day, that she had read the 4 pages counsel had read aloud, and that she would remember them for a very long time. Then she spoke the sentence that would be quoted more than any other. She said that for 6 years, this county had been served by a woman who had no legal right to serve it, and by no one else, that the defendant had not created that condition, that this court had no power to remedy it, and that someone ought to. Delaney Kovacs walked to the clerk's counter and paid $14 in cash, taken from the $1,140 she had. What came afterward came slowly and quietly, and it didn't feel like victory. Dr. Curtis Prosser closed his practice that autumn and went to live with his daughter in Lewisburg, and no one forced him to do it. Warren Pike and Everett Sloan received heavy sentences. Raphael Corsetti pleaded guilty, cooperated with federal authorities, and served 19 months in prison, and he signed over the entire property on Old Quarry Road, along with $4,100,000 in seized assets, to a county community health trust. For the first 7 months, Delaney didn't visit him once. In the 8th month, she went, and she brought the 8th ledger with her. The Ruth Kovacs Clinic opened in Kettle Bend 2 years later, with a fully licensed nurse practitioner and Delaney as its head nurse. The state nursing board restored her right to sit for the licensing examination, subject to 3 years of supervised practice, and she accepted all 3 years without contesting a single word. They married 4 years after the night of the ice storm, and the delay was entirely her doing, and she wouldn't be moved. She said she wouldn't marry until the fine had been paid, until the clinic had been built, and until he had finished serving his sentence, because if she married him while he could still buy her anything, then the 268 people in that ledger would understand that she was no longer the woman they called in the middle of the night. The ledger went on. In time, a 3rd hand appeared in its pages, and then a 4th, because she had trained 3 young women from the valley and required all 3 to follow her mother's way. The cases that went wrong were written first. They were written at greater length than any others. Not a single page was ever hidden. This story leaves behind one very simple truth. A person's worth doesn't lie in the piece of paper someone grants them. It lies in whether anyone comes knocking at their door late at night. And the most enduring thing a person can leave behind isn't money or power, but the fact that they stood beside another human being during the hours when no one else wanted to be there. Some places are forgotten precisely because no one is counting, and all it takes is one person willing to sit down and write every name, one by one, for that place to cease being invisible. And the final question, the one people still argue about to this day, concerns a 22-year-old boy who never took a penny from anyone, who pulled a relay in 4 seconds because his older brother had never given him $1, who confessed after 9 minutes, and who received 6 years, while the man who built the entire system had a lawyer sitting beside him, teaching him how to answer every question. Do you believe that was fair? If today's story touched something inside you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone you believe may need to hear it, so that every day we can bring you more stories worth hearing. How did the story of Delaney Kovacs make you feel? And if you had been in that kitchen that night, what would you have done? Please leave us a few words in the comments, because we truly want to hear what lies deep within your hearts. May everyone watching this video be blessed with good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.